Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. The morning after Christmas, 1996. A mother walks downstairs in her home in Boulder, Colorado, and finds a handwritten note on the staircase. Not a greeting card, not a holiday message left by a houseguest. A ransom note, 3 pages long, written by hand, inside her own house, and her 6-year-old daughter is nowhere to be found. What followed that moment would become one of the most scrutinized, most debated, and most heartbreaking unsolved homicide investigations in American history. Nearly 3 decades later, no one has been charged. No one has been convicted. And the case remains officially open today. Here's what happened. The case at the center of tonight's investigation is the homicide of JonBenét Patricia Ramsey. She was 6 years old. She lived in an affluent neighborhood in Boulder, Colorado. And on the morning of December 26, 1996, she was reported missing from her family's home. By the end of that same day, she would be found dead. Inside that same home, the case divided a nation, exposed serious fractures in how local law enforcement handles high-profile child homicide investigations, and launched decades of public debate that continues to this day. It also helped shape the modern true crime genre as we know it. And yet, for all the attention it has received, for all the news coverage, the documentaries, the grand jury proceedings, and the forensic advances that have come since, the question at the heart of this case remains unanswered. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey? Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. This channel covers true crime cases using documented public records, court filings, official statements, and verified news archives. In a case as high profile as this one, where decades of rumors, tabloid speculation, and unverified theories have mixed with established fact, that distinction matters enormously. Everything you're going to hear tonight comes from publicly available sources. Statements from the Boulder County District Attorney's Office, Boulder Police Department public updates, contemporaneous reporting from outlets including the Associated Press and the Denver Post, and official records made available through legal proceedings. Where the record is incomplete or disputed, we will tell you that. We will not speculate about living individuals who have not been charged. We will not treat unconfirmed theories as facts. And we will treat the life and dignity of a 6-year-old child with the seriousness that life deserves. Now, let's go back to Boulder, Colorado. December 1996. Chapter 1. The morning of December 26, 1996. The first 24 hours. Boulder, Colorado is not the kind of place most people associate with violent crime. It sits at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, home to the University of Colorado, surrounded by the natural beauty that draws people from across the country to settle there. In the mid-1990s, it was, by most measures, one of the safer cities in America. Affluent, educated, quiet. The kind of place where leaving your doors unlocked at night did not seem unreasonable. The kind of place where the idea of a child disappearing from her home on Christmas night would have seemed almost impossible. The Ramsey family had spent Christmas Day, December 25, 1996, celebrating the holiday with friends. By all accounts documented in contemporaneous reporting, it was a normal Christmas. JonBenét, age 6, went to bed that night in her family's home on 15th Street in Boulder. Her father, John Ramsey, was a successful businessman. Her mother, Patsy Ramsey, was a former Miss West Virginia who had become a homemaker and devoted mother. The family also included JonBenét's older brother, Burke, who was 9 years old at the time. At approximately 5:50 in the morning on December 26, 1996, a 911 call was placed from the Ramsey residence. That call, which was logged by Boulder police and has since been the subject of extensive public reporting, brought officers to the home in the early morning hours. Patsy Ramsey, according to contemporaneous accounts, had come downstairs and found a handwritten note on the staircase landing. 3 pages, handwritten, demanding a ransom. Now, think about that for a moment. A ransom note found inside the home. Not slipped under a door. Not left outside. Found on the interior staircase. That detail alone separated this case from virtually every other child abduction report that Boulder police had ever encountered. In a typical abduction scenario, the note, if there is one, arrives after the child goes missing, often by phone or through a drop point. Here, the note was inside the house. The child was not, or so it appeared. When Boulder police officers arrived at the residence in those early morning hours, they were responding to what they understood to be a kidnapping in progress, or at minimum, a missing child report with an associated ransom demand. This framing, the assumption that JonBenét had been taken from the home and was somewhere out in Boulder that morning, would have significant consequences for how the scene was handled in those critical early hours. Forensic experts and criminologists who have reviewed this case publicly in the years since have consistently pointed to the first 24 hours of any homicide investigation as the most critical window for evidence collection. Decisions made in those hours, about who is allowed into a scene, what is touched, what is moved, where officers stand and walk, can determine whether a case is eventually solved or becomes a cold case that haunts investigators for decades. In subsequent public reviews of the Boulder Police Department's handling of this investigation, the early scene management decisions on December 26, 1996, were among the most heavily scrutinized. Before the residence was fully secured as a crime scene, a number of people were present in the home. Friends, family acquaintances, clergy. This is not a secret or a buried detail. It has been widely reported in public records and news archives going back to the days immediately following the discovery. The presence of multiple individuals in a residence before it is treated as a secured crime scene creates the potential for contamination of physical evidence, unintentional movement of objects, and the introduction of trace materials that can complicate forensic analysis later. Whether and to what extent that occurred in this case is something investigators have grappled with ever since. Now here is where the morning of December 26, 1996, takes its most devastating turn. Later that same day, in the afternoon hours, JonBenét Ramsey was found. Not outside, not in the neighborhood, not taken across state lines. She was found inside the family's home, in a basement room. According to public reporting and official records, it was John Ramsey himself who discovered his daughter in that room after officers asked family members to search the residence. The discovery transformed the investigation instantly. This was no longer a kidnapping case with an unknown location and a desperate race against time to recover a living child. This was a homicide investigation, and it was being conducted, from the very first hours, inside a scene that had not been treated as a homicide scene from the moment police arrived. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old. She had participated in children's pageants, a fact that would later receive enormous and at times exploitative media attention. She was a child who, by every account documented in public records, was loved by her family and the people around her. Her death was a tragedy. Full stop. Everything that came after, the investigations, the grand jury, the DNA analyses, the media circus, the cold case reviews, all of it begins with that fact and should never lose sight of it. The cause of death, as established through the official investigation and documented in public records, was homicide. We will not discuss the specific details of the manner of death beyond what is necessary to understand the evidentiary record, because this channel does not exist to sensationalize the suffering of a child. What is relevant to understanding the investigation is that the physical evidence recovered at the scene, including biological trace evidence, would become central to every phase of the case that followed, and continues to be at the center of discussions about potential new forensic techniques today. By the end of December 26, 1996, Boulder, Colorado had a homicide investigation on its hands. And the Boulder Police Department, a force accustomed to the relatively quiet crime landscape of a mid-sized university city, was at the center of it. Here is a question for everyone watching. Put yourself in the position of a first responding officer on that morning. You arrive at a home where a parent is reporting her child missing. There is a ransom note inside the house. You have no reason to believe at that moment that the child is still in the home. What is your priority? Do you lock down the scene immediately and treat it as potential evidence, or do you focus every resource on finding a child who may still be alive somewhere out in the city? That tension, between protecting a scene and pursuing what looks like an active child abduction, is something investigators have discussed at length in the public record. Drop your thoughts in the comments. It is not a simple question. And the answer, in real time, without the benefit of hindsight, is harder than it looks from the outside. Chapter 2. The investigation, the media, and a divided public. In the days and weeks that followed December 26, 1996, the homicide investigation into the death of JonBenét Ramsey began to take shape. The Boulder Police Department held the lead role. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office was also involved from the early stages. And almost immediately, the relationship between those two agencies became a complicating factor in how the case developed. Police departments and prosecutors' offices work together on criminal investigations, but they are separate entities with separate institutional interests and, sometimes, separate views on how evidence should be gathered, how witnesses should be approached, and when, if ever, a case is ready to be brought before a grand jury. In the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, publicly reported tensions between the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder County District Attorney's Office became a documented feature of the case's history. Those tensions, according to contemporaneous reporting from outlets including the Denver Post and the Associated Press, included disagreements over investigative direction, access to witnesses, and evidentiary strategy. Whether those institutional frictions hampered the investigation is a question that has been raised repeatedly in the public record and remains a point of discussion among analysts who study this case. Alongside the investigative process, something else was happening. Something that, in 1996 and 1997, was relatively new and moving fast. The national media descended on Boulder, Colorado. And when I say descended, I mean it in the most comprehensive sense of the word. Tabloid newspapers, network news broadcasts, the nascent cable news infrastructure, which was then just beginning to develop the round-the-clock format we recognize today, found in the JonBenét Ramsey case a story that seemed to have every element that drives public attention. A photogenic child, an affluent family in a quiet town, a mysterious ransom note, an unresolved investigation. And the coverage was relentless. Front pages, nightly segments, talking heads analyzing evidence they had not actually reviewed. Theories presented as fact. The gap between what was actually established in the public record and what was being broadcast to millions of Americans was, at times, enormous. And the consequences of that gap were real. Public opinion formed not on the basis of what investigators had documented, but on the basis of what was most compelling to present on a television screen in a 2-minute segment. One of the elements that received the most public attention was the ransom note itself. The note was unusual in ways that forensic document examiners and investigators have discussed extensively in the public record. It was long, far longer than most ransom notes recovered in abduction cases, running to several handwritten pages. The writing instrument and paper used to compose the note were subjects of investigation. The language used in the note, its phrasing and structure, became the subject of handwriting analysis and linguistic study, details of which have been reported in news archives from the late 1990s onward. The note itself, as a piece of physical evidence, remains part of the open investigative record. Because we are committed to responsible reporting on this channel, we are not going to repeat the specific contents of that note in ways that could be construed as pointing toward or away from any individual who has not been charged. What is established in the public record is that the note was recovered inside the home, that it was examined as a piece of evidence, and that its characteristics have been discussed by law enforcement and forensic professionals in official contexts over the years. As the weeks turned to months and the months turned to years, the investigation continued without producing a charge. The Boulder Police Department gathered evidence. Witnesses were interviewed, physical evidence from the scene was submitted for laboratory analysis, and the public, fed a steady diet of coverage that mixed documented facts with speculation, divided into competing camps with competing theories. It is important to say clearly what this channel will not do in discussing those theories. Over the years, numerous individuals have been publicly identified in media coverage in connection with this case, including individuals who were never charged, never formally named as suspects in official public records, and who are still living. We will not name those individuals. We will not repeat theories that center on uncharged living persons as if those theories were established fact. To do so would not be journalism. It would be irresponsible, and it would be unfair to people who, in the eyes of the law, are presumed innocent. What we can report is what became public through legal proceedings. And one of the most significant legal developments in this case occurred in 1999, when a grand jury was convened in Boulder County to consider the evidence. Grand jury proceedings in the United States are conducted in secret. Witnesses testify, evidence is reviewed, and the grand jury deliberates on whether probable cause exists to bring charges. Those proceedings, in the JonBenét Ramsey case, concluded without any charges being filed. The then Boulder County District Attorney made the decision not to file charges based on the standard required to proceed to trial. Years later, portions of the grand jury's findings became available through a legal process in Colorado courts, and those partial conclusions were reported on by news organizations including the Denver Post. But the absence of charges remained the operative legal reality. No one was indicted, no trial took place, the case remained open. Through all of this, the national conversation about JonBenét Ramsey continued in ways that sometimes bore only a passing resemblance to the actual documented record. The case became a cultural touchstone. It appeared on the covers of national magazines. It was discussed on television programs that presented theory as analysis and speculation as investigative reporting. And somewhere in all of that noise, the documented facts of what happened to a 6-year-old child in Boulder, Colorado, on the night of December 25 into December 26, 1996, were often obscured by the sheer volume of commentary surrounding them. The Ramsey family themselves, John and Patsy Ramsey, became central figures in the public narrative. They gave interviews. They cooperated with certain aspects of the investigation. They engaged legal counsel. They wrote a book. They became, in the media's telling, simultaneously grieving parents and objects of public suspicion, a position that is, by any measure, an almost impossible one to occupy. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in June 2006, before the most significant DNA development in this case would occur 2 years later. John Ramsey has remained a public advocate for continued investigation into his daughter's death, as reported in mainstream news sources. Here's where I want to pause and ask everyone watching a question that gets at something fundamental about this case and about how we consume true crime in general. When a high-profile case like this one generates years of non-stop media coverage, and when that coverage contains a mix of documented fact and unverified theory, how do we, as viewers and readers, sort out what is real from what is simply compelling? How do we hold space for the genuine uncertainty of an unsolved case without filling that uncertainty with the most dramatic available narrative? This is not a rhetorical question. It is something that the JonBenét Ramsey case forces us to grapple with every time we engage with it. Leave your thoughts on that in the comments. Because the way we consume these cases has real consequences, both for the integrity of investigations and for the people caught in the middle of them. Chapter 3. DNA, the 2008 Exoneration Letter, and the Modern Cold Case Era. By the time 2008 arrived, the JonBenét Ramsey case was more than a decade old. The media storm of the late 1990s had faded somewhat from daily headlines, though it never disappeared entirely. Patsy Ramsey had died 2 years prior. The investigation was still open. And then, in July 2008, the Boulder County District Attorney's Office did something significant. Something that carried real legal and moral weight. They issued a public letter formally clearing the members of JonBenét's immediate family. The 2008 Exoneration Letter from the Boulder County District Attorney's Office stated, based on DNA analysis conducted on biological evidence recovered from the scene, that the Ramsey family members were excluded as the source of that DNA. The district attorney at the time, Mary Lacey, wrote directly to John Ramsey and communicated the finding publicly. The letter acknowledged that new DNA technology, specifically testing that went beyond what had been available in the 1990s, had produced results that were inconsistent with any member of JonBenét's immediate family having left the biological trace evidence recovered during the investigation. Let's be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. The 2008 Exoneration Letter cleared the immediate family members from being the source of specific DNA evidence recovered at the scene. It did not, in itself, identify who was responsible for JonBenét's death. It did not close the case. It did not eliminate all questions about the events of December 25 and 26, 1996. What it did do was establish, as a matter of formal official public record, that the family who had borne the weight of public suspicion for more than a decade was not the source of key biological evidence linked to this crime. That is a significant statement. And it deserves to be stated clearly and without equivocation, because for years, much of the public narrative around this case had centered on theories that were directly contradicted by that finding. The DNA evidence at the center of the 2008 analysis was described in public statements from the district attorney's office as male DNA found on items recovered from the scene. The profile did not match any known individual in the available databases. Which meant that, as of 2008, the identity of the person who left that DNA remained unknown. The source of that evidence was an unidentified individual who, as of the date of that letter, had not been located, identified, or charged. Now, here is where the story of this case intersects with one of the most exciting and, in the world of cold case investigations, genuinely transformative developments in modern forensic science. Forensic genetic genealogy. If you follow cold case news at all, you have probably heard about forensic genetic genealogy. It is the technique that brought resolution to dozens of cold cases that once seemed permanently beyond reach, most famously in the identification of the Golden State Killer in California in 2018. The method works by uploading a DNA profile developed from crime scene evidence to genealogical databases that contain the voluntarily submitted DNA profiles of millions of individuals. By identifying partial matches, relatives of the unknown source, investigators can work backward through family trees to narrow down potential candidates and, ultimately, identify a specific individual for further testing and investigation. Officials connected to the JonBenét Ramsey case have publicly acknowledged that forensic genetic genealogy is among the techniques being considered as a potential avenue for re-examining the preserved DNA evidence in this case. Those statements have been covered in mainstream news reporting. The Boulder Police Department and the Boulder County District Attorney's Office have, at various points in recent years, confirmed publicly that the case remains active and that modern forensic tools, including genetic genealogy, represent possible paths forward. This is not a small development. The same forensic methodology that identified perpetrators in cases that had been cold for decades could, in theory, produce a DNA match in the JonBenét Ramsey case that has eluded investigators since 1996. Whether the specific evidence preserved in this case meets the technical requirements for genetic genealogy analysis, whether the DNA profile is of sufficient quality and quantity, is a question for the laboratory scientists and forensic experts involved. But the public discussion of this avenue by officials connected to the case is significant and has been welcomed publicly by John Ramsey. The preservation of evidence in long-running investigations is itself a critical issue that the JonBenét Ramsey case has helped bring into public focus. Evidence collected in 1996 was gathered using the technology and protocols of that era. The science of DNA analysis has advanced dramatically in the nearly 30 years since. Techniques that did not exist in 1996 have become standard practice. Tests that once required large samples can now be conducted on microscopic quantities of biological material. The question of whether evidence collected decades ago, stored, and maintained can be subjected to modern analysis is one that cold case investigators across the country grapple with in case after case. And it is a question with direct relevance to what happens next in Boulder, Colorado. Now, let us talk about the broader trajectory of this case over the years, because the investigation did not simply sit static between 1998 and today. There were periods of renewed public attention. There were developments that generated headlines and then faded without producing resolution. In 2006, a man named John Mark Carr publicly claimed to have been responsible for JonBenét's death. That claim generated enormous media coverage. And then DNA testing established that Carr's DNA did not match the evidence recovered from the scene. The charges that had briefly been associated with his claim were dropped. The DNA profile remained unmatched. The case remained open. The Carr episode is a stark illustration of the dangers of treating unverified claims in a high-profile case as resolved fact before evidence is actually tested. The case has also been transferred between institutional jurisdictions at various points. There were periods when the Boulder Police Department held primary responsibility for the ongoing investigation. There were periods when the Boulder County District Attorney's Office took a more active role. Those transfers of institutional responsibility, while not uncommon in long-running cold cases, created their own complications in terms of investigative continuity, access to evidence and case files, and the institutional memory required to manage a decades-long investigation. Publicly, officials in Boulder have, in recent years, stated their commitment to resolving this case. The Boulder Police Department has maintained a dedicated unit for reviewing the case. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office has made public statements affirming that the investigation remains active. And the family of JonBenét Ramsey has been publicly vocal about their support for continued investigation and their hope that modern forensic technology will eventually produce the identification that decades of prior investigation have not. Let's take a moment to think about the legacy of this case beyond Boulder, Colorado. Because the JonBenét Ramsey investigation did not just affect the people directly involved. It had measurable consequences for how law enforcement agencies across the country approach high-profile child homicide investigations. The public criticism of early scene management decisions in Boulder prompted discussions at the professional and policy level about the protocols for securing crime scenes in cases that initially present as abductions. The documented tensions between the Boulder Police Department and the District Attorney's Office contributed to broader conversations about interagency coordination in major investigations. And the overwhelming media coverage of the case, and the ways in which that coverage sometimes interfered with or distorted the investigative record, became a case study in the relationship between law enforcement, the press, and the public in high-profile criminal matters. The case also played a significant role in the rise of true crime as a genre. In the mid to late 1990s, cable television was developing the infrastructure for round-the-clock news and commentary. The JonBenét Ramsey case was one of the first to receive the kind of sustained, multi-platform media coverage that we now associate with major true crime stories. It established, for better and for worse, a template for how cases of this kind are covered, discussed, and consumed by the public. And it raised questions that the true crime genre, as a whole, still has not fully resolved. Questions about the line between informing the public and exploiting victims. About the difference between investigative reporting and entertainment. About what we owe to victims, to their families, and to the integrity of investigations when we choose to cover these cases. Here's the third question I want to leave with everyone watching, because this one gets at something I think is genuinely worth sitting with. Given everything we now know about how the coverage of this case unfolded, given the way public attention sometimes generated more heat than light, given the ways in which uncharged individuals were discussed in media as if the question of their culpability were settled when it was not, and given the way a 6-year-old child's image was commodified by a media ecosystem hungry for compelling content, what does responsible engagement with a case like this actually look like? Not just for journalists, for all of us who click, watch, share, and comment. What do we owe to JonBenét Ramsey when we discuss her case nearly 30 years after her death? Think about that, seriously. Because the answer to that question shapes the kind of conversation this community wants to have about true crime, and it is a conversation worth having honestly. Let us talk about where things stand today. And let us be precise about this, because precision matters. As of the date of this video, the homicide investigation into the death of JonBenét Patricia Ramsey is classified as an open cold case by the Boulder Police Department. No individual has been charged in connection with her death. No individual has been tried. No individual has been convicted. The DNA evidence recovered from the scene, which was used in 2008 to formally clear JonBenét's immediate family members, produced a male DNA profile that has not been matched to any identified individual. That profile is what any future forensic analysis, including potential forensic genetic genealogy testing, would need to work from. Officials connected to the Boulder investigation have made public statements in recent years acknowledging that forensic genetic genealogy is a technique they are aware of and are considering in the context of this case. Those statements represent the most significant public acknowledgement of a potential path forward in this investigation in recent memory. Whether that path will ultimately lead to an identification, and whether any identification would lead to charges, a trial, and a resolution, are questions that remain open. The Boulder Police Department has maintained that the case is actively being worked. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office has similarly affirmed its commitment to seeking justice for JonBenét. John Ramsey has, according to public reporting, continued to engage with investigators and to advocate publicly for the use of every available forensic tool to identify the person responsible for his daughter's death. His position, as covered in mainstream news sources, has been consistent. The DNA evidence exists. Modern technology has advanced beyond what was available in 1996 or even in 2008, and the person who killed JonBenét Ramsey can potentially be identified if that technology is applied to the preserved evidence. For those who follow cold case investigations, the parallels to other cases where forensic genetic genealogy produced identifications after decades of failure are obvious and, potentially, encouraging. In case after case, evidence that was collected years or even decades ago and then preserved, evidence that was tested with the technology of its time and produced no match, has been re-examined with forensic genetic genealogy techniques and produced identifications. The method is not a guarantee. It depends on the quality and quantity of the DNA profile available, on the databases being searched, and on whether relatives of the unknown source have submitted their own DNA voluntarily. But in case after case, it has produced results where other methods had not. The question is not whether forensic genetic genealogy could, in theory, identify the source of the DNA evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case. In theory, it could. The question is whether the preserved evidence in this specific case meets the technical threshold required for that analysis to be conducted successfully. And that is a question that can only be answered in the laboratory, by the scientists who examine the actual evidence. Not in a YouTube video. Not on a podcast. In the lab, by the people who do this work. What we can say, with confidence, based on the public record, is this. The JonBenét Ramsey case is not forgotten. It is not closed. It is not beyond reach. The evidence preserved from December 26, 1996, is still there. The DNA profile of an unidentified individual is still there. The investigators who have dedicated years of their careers to this case are still there. And the technology that did not exist when JonBenét was found, and did not exist when her family was cleared in 2008, exists today and is being used to solve cases that once seemed permanently cold. The broader legacy of this case for cold case investigation practice in the United States is also worth acknowledging. Policy discussions around evidence preservation standards, around the need for interagency protocols in high-profile investigations, around the importance of scene management in cases that initially present as one type of crime and turn out to be another, all of these have been informed, at least in part, by what happened and what did not happen in Boulder, Colorado, starting on December 26, 1996. The mistakes documented in public reviews of the early investigation have been cited in training materials and professional discussions within law enforcement. In that sense, the case has contributed, in a painful and imperfect way, to the improvement of investigative practices that may help solve other cases. But none of that addresses the fundamental question. None of that gives John Ramsey the answer he has spent nearly 3 decades seeking. None of that gives JonBenét the justice she deserves. And none of it closes the wound that opened in a quiet Boulder neighborhood on a cold December night in 1996. Resolution and current status. Let us be clear, complete, and precise about where this case stands as of today. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, age 6, was found dead in her family's home in Boulder, Colorado, on December 26, 1996. Her death was ruled a homicide. The Boulder Police Department initiated an investigation that has been ongoing, in various forms, for nearly 3 decades. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office has been involved at multiple stages of that investigation. In 2008, the Boulder County District Attorney formally and publicly cleared the members of JonBenét's immediate family based on DNA evidence, establishing in the official record that the biological trace evidence recovered from the scene was not consistent with any family member. That DNA profile remains attributed to an unidentified individual. No one has been charged. No one has been convicted. The case is classified as an open investigation. Officials have publicly discussed forensic genetic genealogy as a potential avenue for re-examining the preserved DNA evidence. That discussion represents the most significant potential development in the case in recent years, and it is one that investigators, the surviving Ramsey family, and the public have reason to watch closely. Whether it will produce a resolution is unknown. What is known is that the investigation continues, that the evidence is preserved, that the science is advancing, and that, nearly 30 years after a 6-year-old child was taken from the world, the people responsible for finding the answer have not given up. JonBenét Ramsey was a child who loved life, who had a family who loved her, who deserved to grow up. Every serious engagement with this case, every responsible piece of reporting, every careful review of the evidence, should begin and end with that fact. She was not a mystery to be solved for entertainment. She was a person, and the people who have worked this case, the investigators who have spent years poring over evidence, the prosecutors who have wrestled with questions of what the law requires versus what justice demands, and the family members who have lived with this loss every day since December 26, 1996, deserve to have that truth recognized as well. This case is a mirror. It reflects back at us some of the most difficult questions about how we as a society handle violent crime, how our media covers it, how our institutions respond to it, how our forensic science has evolved to address it, and how far we still have to go. Those are not comfortable reflections, but they are important ones, and they are why a case that is nearly 30 years old continues to generate the kind of attention and discussion that you are participating in right now by watching this video. If you have followed this case for years, there may be details in tonight's account that are familiar to you. And there may be things you expected us to say that we did not. Theories we did not repeat. Individuals we did not name. Specifics we deliberately left out. That is intentional. This channel's commitment is to the documented record, not to the compelling narrative. And in a case this old and this heavily covered, the distance between those two things can be significant. If forensic genetic genealogy testing is applied to the DNA evidence in this case and produces a result, we will cover that development here. Sourced, documented, responsible, as every development in this case deserves to be covered. Until then, the case remains what it has always been, open, unresolved, and waiting for the answer that JonBenét Ramsey's memory deserves. Closing thoughts. Nearly 30 years ago, a child lost her life. A family lost everything they had known. A community lost its sense of safety. And a nation became fixated, in ways that were not always healthy or fair, on a crime it could not explain and could not stop talking about. The JonBenét Ramsey case remains unresolved, but it does not remain untouched by time. The science that could not help in 1996 has advanced beyond what anyone involved in that initial investigation could have imagined. And the possibility that an answer still exists, in preserved evidence, in an advancing laboratory technique, in a database somewhere that holds a partial match to a decades-old DNA profile, is real. It is not certainty, but it is real. True crime, done responsibly, is not just about recounting what happened. It is about keeping public attention and public pressure on cases that might otherwise fade from view. It is about honoring victims by treating their stories with the seriousness and the accuracy they deserve. And it is about holding our institutions, our investigative agencies, our prosecutors, our media, and ourselves accountable for how we handle cases that involve human lives and human loss. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. The least we can do, decades later, is engage with what happened to her honestly and carefully, with full respect for what the documented record says, and full awareness of the limits of what we know. If you think you know what happened to JonBenét Ramsey, drop your theory in the comments. We go through every comment, and this is a community that takes these cases seriously. If you want to see more carefully sourced, responsibly reported cold case breakdowns like this one, please like this video, subscribe to True Crime Mysteries, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. New cases all the time. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.